Watauga County, North Carolina, November 1886. The first snow had come early that year, dusting the high peaks of the Blue Ridge before the leaves had fully turned. In a narrow valley where Cove Creek cut through limestone and oak, a man named Silas Harmon was about to become the laughingstock of 3 townships. What made them laugh wasn't his age. At 62, he was building his 4th cabin. It wasn't his heritage. Half Cherokee blood meant little anymore in these mountains. It was the walls. Those impossible, wasteful, ridiculous walls. Double walls, they called them, shaking their heads. Like building 2 cabins just to live in one. While his neighbors notched their logs tight and chinked them proper, Silas was doing something different. Something that made experienced builders stop their mules just to stare. He was leaving a gap, a deliberate, measured space between 2 separate walls of hewn chestnut logs. 18 inches of nothing but air. "Man's gone soft in the head," said Thomas Bradley, whose family had been raising cabins in these mountains since before the Revolution. "Winter will teach him soon enough." But Silas Harmon had learned something in 62 years that Thomas Bradley, for all his family tradition, had never stopped to consider. He'd learned it from his mother's people, who'd kept warm in these same mountains for 1,000 winters. He'd learned it from watching how the earth itself held heat in certain places and shed it in others. And he'd learned it from one brutal February night in 1869 that had taken his wife and youngest daughter while he'd fed their fireplace log after log after log, never getting ahead of the cold that seeped through their walls like water through a sieve. The question wasn't whether Silas Harmon's walls looked crazy. The question was, what did this backwoods carpenter understand about heat that 3 generations of expert builders had missed? Before we show you exactly what happened when winter came, and the numbers that proved everyone wrong, do something for me. Hit that like button right now, and subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to show you building techniques that could save your life if the grid goes down, and I only share them with people serious enough to join this community. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and I'll personally reply with a traditional building technique specific to your region that most people have forgotten. Deal? Good. Let's continue. December 1886 arrived cold and dry. The old-timers recognized it immediately as set-up winter, the kind that lulls you with moderate temperatures and light snows, making you burn through your woodpile at a comfortable pace. And then, when you're 5 cords lighter than you should be, January arrives like a wolf. Silas Harmon's cabin stood finished by mid-December. From the outside, it looked almost comical. 2 complete walls of chestnut logs, each 12 inches thick, separated by that 18-inch gap that had become the subject of so much ridicule. His neighbors had calculated the waste. Silas had cut and hauled nearly double the timber a proper cabin required. Time, labor, and lumber, all of it squandered on air. "It's not just air," Silas had tried to explain to Bradley one afternoon. "It's trapped air, still air. There's a difference." Bradley had laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of a man whose grandfather's cabin still stood solid after 80 years. "Silas, I've built 17 cabins in my time. My daddy built 23. Air don't keep nothing warm. Dense timber does. Tight chinking does. You're solving a problem that don't exist." But Silas had filled that 18-inch gap with something. Not solid. That would defeat the purpose. He'd created a matrix of thin cedar slats, running horizontally every 2 feet, creating compartments of trapped air between the walls. In some of those compartments, he'd loosely packed dry moss and pine needles. In others, he'd left only air. The pattern seemed random to observers, but Silas had a system. He'd positioned the insulated compartments behind where his hearth would radiate heat, and the air-only compartments everywhere else. "He's making it complicated for no reason," said Marcus Finn, a stonemason who'd worked on the courthouse in Boone. "Heat rises and escapes. That's nature. You can't trap it with tricks." What none of them knew was that Silas had built a smaller version first, just 1 wall section, 8 feet by 8 feet, standing free in his barn. Through November, he tested it. He'd built fires on one side, measured temperatures on both sides, added and removed different filling materials, adjusted the gap width. His neighbors never saw this. They only saw the final result, a cabin that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd forgotten how to build halfway through. The inner wall, the one facing the living space, was finished smooth. Tight joints, minimal gaps, chinked with a mixture of clay and cattail fiber. The outer wall was rougher, deliberately so. Silas had left small gaps between certain logs, not for ventilation exactly, but for what he called breathing. He tried to explain it once. A wall that can't move, air can't dry. A wall that can't dry will rot. A wall that rots won't insulate nothing. By Christmas, Silas was settled in. His hearth wasn't large, just 4 feet wide, built from creek stone with a firebox angled slightly forward. Nothing fancy, nothing that would impress Marcus Finn. But Silas had positioned it precisely against the center of his north wall, where the double wall gap was packed most densely with insulation. On December 28th, Thomas Bradley stopped by with a ham. A peace offering, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. The temperature outside was hovering around 25 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. Inside Silas's cabin, Bradley immediately noticed something odd. It was warm, genuinely warm, and Silas's woodpile outside looked barely touched. "How much you burning?" Bradley asked, trying to sound casual. 3 logs in the morning, 2 at midday, 3 at evening, Silas said. Sometimes 4 at night, if it's bitter. Bradley did the math in his head. That was less than half what his own cabin required to maintain comfort. He looked around for the trick. Maybe Silas was just tolerating a colder interior temperature. But no, it was actually warmer in here than Bradley's own home. "Where's your heat going?" Bradley asked, genuinely confused now. Silas tapped the wall behind his hearth. "It's not going nowhere. That's the point. It's staying." To understand what Silas Harmon had figured out, you have to forget everything you think you know about cabin construction and start with a simple question. Where does heat actually go? The builders of 1886 knew that heat rises. Everyone knew that. They knew that wind steals warmth. That's why you chink the gaps. They knew that a good thick log wall held some heat. That's why you use 12-inch timber instead of 6. But what they didn't understand, what none of them had stopped to measure or test, was the difference between thermal mass and thermal resistance. A solid log wall has thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. That's good for stability, bad for efficiency. When you heat one side of a 12-inch chestnut log, the heat conducts through the wood at a predictable rate. In winter, this means the warmth from your fire is constantly traveling through your wall to the cold outside air. The thicker your wall, the slower this happens, but it always happens. You're not stopping heat loss. You're just slowing it down. Silas's double wall didn't work on thermal mass. It worked on thermal resistance. That 18-inch gap, filled with compartmentalized air and loose organic material, created something the solid log builders never achieved, a genuine thermal break. Heat from the fire would warm the inner wall, but instead of conducting directly through to the outside, it hit that air gap and stopped. Not completely, but enough to change the fundamental efficiency of the structure. Here's what the experts missed. Still air is one of nature's best insulators. Not moving air that just carries heat away. Still air. Trapped air. Air that can't convect, can't carry warmth from the hot side to the cold side. Silas's cedar slat matrix created dozens of small air compartments, each one preventing convection currents from forming. The heat couldn't travel through the air because the air couldn't move. The loose moss and pine needle filling in certain compartments added another layer of resistance. These materials trapped even more air in their fibrous structure. Thousands of tiny pockets, each one interrupting heat transfer. But Silas hadn't filled every compartment. He'd left some as pure air gaps, particularly in the upper sections of the walls where rising heat would naturally accumulate. This wasn't random. It was strategic. The air-only compartments allowed some flexibility, some pressure equalization, some moisture management that the fully packed sections couldn't provide. Marcus Finn, the stonemason, had called it complicated for no reason. But the complication was the reason. A single large air gap would allow convection, warm air rising on the heated side, cool air falling on the cold side, creating a circulating current that would transfer heat efficiently from inside to outside. That's the last thing you want. Silas's compartmentalized approach prevented this circulation. The cedar slats broke the gap into isolated cells, each one too small to sustain a convection current. The outer wall served a different purpose entirely. It wasn't there to hold heat. It was there to block wind and shed weather. The rough finish and deliberate gaps Silas had left allowed moisture vapor to escape. This was crucial. The inner wall, being warmer, would naturally drive any moisture in the wood toward the colder outer wall. If that moisture got trapped between the walls, it would condense, accumulate, rot the timber, and destroy the insulation value of the air gap. But if it could escape through the outer wall, the system stayed dry. Dry wood insulates better than wet wood. Dry air insulates better than humid air. Silas understood this not from textbooks. There were no textbooks, but from observation. He'd watch how certain rock overhangs stayed warmer in winter, how caves maintained stable temperatures, how the earth itself, just a few feet down, never froze. All of these natural systems had the same principle. Layers of different materials creating resistance to heat flow with the ability to manage moisture. A solid cabin wall, no matter how thick, was fighting against physics. Silas's double wall was working with it. Thomas Bradley's grandfather's cabin, the one that had stood for 80 years, was well built by the standards of the time. Tight joints, quality timber, good chinking. But it was also a thermal sieve. Heat poured through those 12-inch walls at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 times what Silas's double wall allowed. Bradley's family didn't know this in numbers, but they knew it in cords of wood. They knew it in how close you had to stay to the fire to feel warm. They knew it in how brutal the cold felt in the corner farthest from the hearth. The irony was that the expert builders were building the same cabin their grandfathers had built, which meant they were also making the same mistakes. They perfected a technique that was fundamentally inefficient. Their tight joints and thick timbers represented mastery of a flawed system. Meanwhile, Silas, dismissed as crazy, wasteful, overcomplicated, had done something they couldn't recognize. He'd observed, experimented, and innovated. He'd asked not, how did my grandfather build, but how does heat actually behave? By early January 1887, the theoretical advantages of Silas's design were about to become measurable, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. Because the winter that had been playing gentle was about to show its teeth. January 9th, 1887. The barometric pressure had been falling for 2 days straight. The old-timers recognized the signs. A dry cold settling in from the northwest, the kind that made tree sap freeze and split the trunks from inside. By sunset on the 9th, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the wind arrived. What the weather records from Blowing Rock would later call the Cold Siege of 1887 hit the high country of North Carolina like a physical force. For 6 consecutive days, daytime temperatures never rose above 0 Fahrenheit. Nighttime lows reached minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit on January 12th, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit on January 14th. The wind, channeling through the mountain gaps, created conditions that felt like minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. Creeks froze solid. Livestock died in their barns despite sheltering. And in every cabin across 3 counties, families faced the same desperate mathematics. Burn wood faster than you can afford, or freeze. Thomas Bradley's household went through 4 cords of oak in those 6 days. A month's worth of fuel consumed in less than a week. They kept 2 fires going, the main hearth and a smaller cook stove, both burning continuously. The family slept in shifts, someone always awake to feed the flames. Despite this, the interior temperature in Bradley's cabin never rose above 48 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. At night, it dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit in the corners farthest from the hearth. Water in the washing basin froze. Breath condensed on the walls and formed frost patterns by morning. They weren't alone. Across the valley, Marcus Finn's stone house, which he'd built himself with 2-foot-thick walls, proud of its solidity, fared even worse. Stone has tremendous thermal mass, which means it holds heat while once warmed. But it also means it absorbs heat relentlessly, pulling warmth from the air to heat the massive cold walls. Finn burned through 5 cords. His children slept in the room closest to the hearth, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. The rest of the house became uninhabitable. On the evening of January 12th, when the temperature outside hit minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, Bradley made his way to Silas Harmon's cabin. The visit wasn't social. Bradley's youngest son had developed a rattling cough, and his wife was worried it would turn to pneumonia. They needed to know, was there room in Silas's cabin for the boy, just until the cold broke? Bradley expected to find Silas in the same desperate situation everyone else faced, huddled near a roaring fire, burning through reserves, making impossible decisions about rationing fuel. What he found instead stopped him at the door. Silas was sitting at his table, shirt sleeves rolled up, eating soup. The fire in his hearth was modest, 4 logs, burning steadily but not dramatically. And the interior of the cabin felt like spring. Bradley stood there, snowflakes melting on his shoulders, trying to process what his senses were telling him. It was genuinely warm in here. Not tolerable for winter warm. Actually comfortable. "Thomas," Silas said, standing. "Your boy all right?" Bradley couldn't answer immediately. He was looking at Silas's woodpile, visible through a window. It looked almost untouched. Then he turned to the hearth. A normal-sized fire, nothing excessive. Then back to the room temperature, which felt like it had to be 60 degrees? Higher? Ow! Bradley finally managed. Silas gestured to the walls. "Told you. The heat stays." Before I show you the exact numbers that proved Silas right, measurements that made experienced builders question everything they knew, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happens next isn't just about one man's clever wall design. It's about the moment an entire community had to admit that traditional knowledge, when actually understood rather than just repeated, contains engineering principles that modern building often ignores. Drop a comment right now with your location, and I'll tell you which historical building technique from your region could cut your heating costs in half. Now let's look at the data. Over the next 3 days, as the cold continued its assault, other families began noticing what Bradley had discovered. Smoke from Silas's chimney was visible but modest, a thin, steady stream, not the heavy output pouring from every other stack in the valley. People started doing mental math, comparing what they were burning against what Silas appeared to be using. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. On January 15th, Marcus Finn, whose stone house was consuming firewood faster than any other structure in the area, walked through knee-deep snow to Silas's cabin. He brought a thermometer, not the crude alcohol thermometers most families owned, but a precision mercury instrument he'd acquired for his masonry work, capable of accurate readings from minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. "I need a measure," Finn said simply when Silas opened the door. Silas nodded. He understood. Finn wasn't there to apologize or admit error. He was there because the numbers mattered more than pride. That's the mark of a real craftsman. Finn took readings in multiple locations. Near the hearth at the center of the room, in the corners, near the walls, at floor level, and at head height. Then he went outside and took external readings on both the north wall and south wall. Then he did something unusual. He asked Silas if he could bore a small hole through the outer wall to measure the temperature in that 18-inch gap. Silas agreed. What Finn's thermometer revealed changed the conversation permanently. Marcus Finn was a man who trusted mathematics more than opinions. When he took measurements in Silas Harmon's cabin on that bitter January afternoon, he did so with a methodical precision that had made him the best stonemason in 3 counties. What his mercury thermometer revealed wasn't just surprising, it was revolutionary. External temperature, north wall, shaded minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit. External temperature, south wall, sun exposed minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature near hearth, 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature at room center, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature at corners, farthest from heat source, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature at floor level, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. These numbers alone were remarkable. A 78-degree differential between outside and inside in the corners, and an 87-degree differential near the hearth. But what stunned Finn was the consistency. In his own stone house, The temperature variation from hearth to corner was often 30 degrees or more. You roasted near the fire and froze 10 feet away. Silas's cabin showed only a 13-degree variation between the warmest point and the coldest corner. But the truly revealing measurement came from that hole Finn bored into the gap between the double walls. Temperature in the air gap, northern wall, behind hearth, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature in the air gap, eastern wall, no direct heat, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature in the air gap, southern wall, sun exposure, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Finn stared at those numbers, running the calculations in his mind. The air gap itself was maintaining temperatures far above freezing, even on the walls receiving no direct solar gain and no direct radiant heat. This meant the inner wall wasn't losing heat to the outside at anything close to the rate a solid wall would. The gap was functioning as a genuine thermal buffer. He pulled out a small notebook and began calculating heat loss rates based on the temperature gradients he was measuring. In a solid 12-inch log wall, with an interior surface at 67 degrees Fahrenheit and an exterior surface at minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit, you're looking at a differential of 83 degrees driving heat through the timber. Chestnut has a thermal conductivity of roughly 0.12 BTU per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit per inch of thickness. For a 12-inch wall, that works out to significant continuous heat loss, enough to require constant heavy fuel consumption to maintain interior temperature. But Silas's double wall had something different. A 67 degrees Fahrenheit interior surface, then an 18-inch gap holding at roughly 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then an exterior surface at minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat gradient was split across two resistance zones: 12 inches of chestnut log, inner wall, 18 inches of compartmentalized air and loose fill, and another 12 inches of chestnut log, outer wall. The effective R value, thermal resistance, was roughly 3.5 times better than a standard cabin wall of the period. Finn wrote this down, but he knew the builders of Watauga County didn't think in R values or BTUs. They thought in cords of wood and hours of warmth. So he asked the practical questions. How much were you burning per day, Silas? Been tracking it, Silas said, pulling out his own rough ledger. Since the cold settled in on the 9th, between 8 and 10 logs daily. Depends on the wind. Finn knew his own consumption, 30 to 35 logs daily, and his house was still barely tolerable. Bradley was burning similar amounts. Most families in the area were consuming 25 to 40 logs per day just to maintain survivable interior conditions. 8 to 10 logs. Finn did the math. At that rate, Silas would burn approximately 1.25 cords during the 6-day cold siege. Finn's household would burn 5 cords. Bradley's would burn 4. The average cabin in the valley would burn 3 to 4 cords minimum. The fuel efficiency advantage wasn't marginal. It was approximately 300% to 400%. But efficiency wasn't the full story. The real advantage was comfort and safety. In Finn's house, despite burning maximum fuel, the corners stayed cold enough to freeze water. Children had to sleep in one room, adults in another, everyone clustered around heat sources. The risk of frostbite, pneumonia, or worse was genuine. In Silas's cabin, the entire living space maintained temperatures that would be comfortable in any season. You could sleep anywhere. Children could play in any corner. The risk of cold-related illness was effectively eliminated. Finn measured one more thing before he left: heat retention. He asked Silas to let the fire burn down to coals without adding fuel. Then he took temperature readings every 30 minutes for 3 hours. In a standard cabin, once the fire diminishes, interior temperature drops rapidly, often 15 to 20 degrees in the first hour. But in Silas's cabin, the thermal mass of the warmed inner wall, combined with the insulating buffer of the air gap, created a different pattern. After 3 hours with only residual coals, the interior temperature had dropped only 11 degrees, from 67 degrees Fahrenheit to 56 degrees Fahrenheit. And the rate of decline was slowing, not accelerating. Finn calculated that the cabin would remain above freezing for at least 12 hours with no fire at all, possibly longer. This had profound practical implications. It meant Silas could let his fire go out completely at night, sleep soundly, and wake to a cabin still warm enough to function in. It meant if he had to leave for a day, to check trap lines, visit neighbors, whatever, he wouldn't return to a frozen interior requiring hours of intense burning just to make the space habitable again. The thermal stability of the structure gave him freedom that other cabin dwellers simply didn't have. When Finn returned to his stone house that evening, he sat down and wrote everything out in careful detail. The measurements, the calculations, the fuel consumption comparisons. He was a proud man, and admitting error didn't come easily. But he was also honest enough to recognize when empirical data contradicted his assumptions. 3 days later, when the cold finally broke and temperatures climbed back above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Finn walked to Thomas Bradley's place. He brought his notes. "We need to talk about Silas's walls," Finn said, "and we need to talk about how wrong we were." Word travels fast in mountain communities, especially when it concerns survival. By late January 1887, every family within 15 miles of Cove Creek had heard about Silas Harmon's cabin and the measurements Marcus Finn had taken. Some remained skeptical. Numbers on paper meant little compared to generations of building tradition. But others, particularly those who nearly exhausted their winter fuel supplies during the cold siege, started asking different questions. The shift began not with the expert builders, but with the desperate ones. Jacob Yount was a farmer, not a carpenter. His family's cabin was small, drafty, and had barely kept them alive through mid-January. On February 3rd, he appeared at Silas's door with a proposition. "Show me how to build those walls, and I'll help you clear that timber tract you've been eyeing." Silas agreed. What followed was something unusual for the time, a genuine knowledge transfer based not on family tradition or apprenticeship, but on demonstrated results. Silas walked Jacob through the entire system. The gap width calculation, 18 inches optimal for available materials and typical wall height. The cedar slat spacing, every 24 inches vertically to prevent convection while minimizing lumber. The compartment filling strategy, dense insulation behind heat sources, air only in moisture-prone areas, and the critical outer wall detailing. Deliberate gaps for vapor escape positioned at the top third of the wall. Jacob took notes. He asked questions. And in early March, when the ground thawed enough for foundation work, he began building. Thomas Bradley watched this from a distance. His pride still stung from having dismissed Silas so confidently, but pride wasn't keeping his family warm. On March 12th, he showed up at the Yount building site. He didn't say much, just observed, measured dimensions with a string, examined the cedar slat arrangement. After an hour, he turned to Silas. The gap. Why exactly 18 inches? Why not 12 or 24? It was a genuine technical question, the kind one craftsman asks another when trying to understand principles rather than just copy procedures. Silas recognized this and gave a genuine answer. Try different widths on my test wall. 12 inches works, but you don't get as much thermal benefit. The temperature gradient is steeper. 24 inches starts to allow convection currents if you don't compartmentalize perfectly, and you use a lot more lumber for the slats. 18 inches hit the balance. Maximum insulation value with minimum complication. But, Silas added carefully, that's for a wall 8 feet high with these materials. Different height, different gap. It's not a rule. It's physics. Bradley nodded slowly. This was the answer of someone who'd experimented, measured, and understood, not someone following tradition or guessing. For the first time, Bradley saw Silas not as an eccentric carpenter, but as an engineer. By April 1887, 3 new cabins were under construction using Silas's double-wall method. By summer, 7. Each builder adapted the core principle to their specific situation. Available timber species, local climate variations, family size requirements. Joseph Creek, building at higher elevation where wind was more severe, made his outer wall thicker and his gap 20 inches. Samuel Greer, working with limited timber, reduced both walls to 10 inches each but kept the 18-inch gap. The principle proved flexible. Marcus Finn, whose stone house had performed so poorly during the cold siege, faced a different challenge. He couldn't rebuild. His house represented years of work and significant expense. But he could adapt. In May, He began constructing an interior wooden wall inside his stone house, creating an air gap between stone exterior and wooden interior. It wasn't identical to Silas's approach. The thermal mass of the stone created different dynamics, but the principle of thermal resistance through trapped air remained the same. By the following winter, Finn's fuel consumption had dropped by approximately 40%, and the interior temperature distribution had become far more even. The most significant adoption came from an unexpected source, the missionary school being built near Blowing Rock. The project's supervisor, a man named William Ferris from Pennsylvania, had heard about the double-wall cabins and rode out to examine Yount's completed structure in September. He brought an engineer's notebook and a background in industrial building. After a day of measurements and questions, he made a decision that would influence regional architecture for decades. "We're modifying the school plans," Ferris announced to his construction crew. Double-wall construction throughout, based on the Harmon method. This was significant because the school wasn't a small cabin. It was a 2-story institutional building with a budget and oversight. When it proved successful, and it did, reducing projected heating costs by an estimated 65%, the technique gained legitimacy beyond folk practice. County records from 1888 show building permits for 12 structures explicitly describing double-wall cavity construction for thermal efficiency. A remarkable adoption rate for a technique that had been dismissed as crazy just 2 years earlier. But perhaps the most telling measure of the turning point came in November 1887, when Thomas Bradley began dismantling his family's cabin. The one his grandfather had built, the one that had stood for 80 years. He salvaged every usable log, every stone from the foundation. And then, with Silas Harmon's guidance, he rebuilt it using double-wall construction. When neighbors asked why he'd go to such trouble, Bradley's answer was simple: "Because I got tired of feeding trees to a fire just to keep my children from freezing." Silas figured out something my grandfather never knew. And pride don't keep nobody warm. By December 1887, when the first serious cold arrived, though nothing like the previous January, 19 structures in Watauga County and surrounding areas were operating with some version of the double-wall principle. The fuel savings across those households was measurable not just in cords of wood, but in hours of labor, in reduced risk, in comfort and quality of life. A technique that had been mocked 12 months earlier was now becoming standard practice among builders who valued performance over tradition. The social shift was equally significant. Silas Harmon, who'd been treated as an eccentric at best and a fool at worst, was now regularly consulted on building projects. People came from neighboring counties to see his cabin, to ask questions, to understand the principles. He was 63 years old and had become, without seeking the title, the region's leading authority on thermal-efficient construction. What had changed wasn't the technology. The materials and methods were available to everyone all along. What changed was the willingness to question assumptions, to test rather than assume, to value empirical results over inherited tradition. The cold siege of January 1887 had done more than freeze creeks and test structures. It had forced an entire community to confront the difference between doing things the way they'd always been done and doing things the way they actually worked best. The story of Silas Harmon's double-wall cabin didn't end with the adoptions of 1887 to 1888. Its influence rippled forward through time in ways that reveal something important about how knowledge spreads, gets lost, and sometimes gets rediscovered. By 1895, double-wall construction had become common enough in the North Carolina highlands that it no longer drew comment. Builders didn't call it the Harmon method anymore. It was just how you built if you wanted a warm cabin without burning excessive fuel. The principle had been absorbed into regional vernacular architecture, which is how most effective techniques spread. They stopped being innovations and become traditions. Local records from the early 1900s show that approximately 40% of new cabin construction in Watauga, Avery, and Ashe counties incorporated some form of cavity wall design with air gaps. The specific dimensions varied. Some builders used 15 inches, others 24. But the core principle remained: thermal resistance through trapped air, compartmentalized to prevent convection. Then something interesting happened. The technique nearly disappeared. As the 20th century progressed, several factors converged to push double wall construction out of favor. Manufactured insulation materials became available. First mineral wool, then fiberglass bats, making it possible to insulate a single wall structure without the labor and lumber of building two complete walls. Central heating systems reduced the reliance on a single hearth, changing the thermal dynamics of residential design. And perhaps most significantly, the generation that remembered why the double wall mattered. The people who'd lived through winters without it passed away. By 1950, you'd be hard-pressed to find a builder in North Carolina who knew about Silas Harmon or his cabin. The technique hadn't been formally documented in building manuals. It existed only in the physical structures themselves and in the fading memories of old-timers. When those structures aged out and were replaced with modern construction, the knowledge went with them. But here's where the story takes a turn that Silas himself would have appreciated. Physics doesn't forget, even when people do. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, builders and homeowners suddenly became very interested in thermal efficiency again. Fuel costs spiked. People started asking hard questions about heat loss and insulation values. And some researchers, digging into historical building techniques, started noticing something in old mountain cabins. Those that had survived from the late 1800s and showed cavity wall construction performed remarkably well in thermal testing. A 1979 study by Appalachian State University's Appropriate Technology Program examined 15 surviving double-wall cabins in the region. They found that these structures, built with no modern insulation materials, achieved effective R values between R24 and R30, comparable to modern well-insulated construction. More remarkably, the cabins showed minimal moisture damage despite being nearly a century old, suggesting that the vapor management strategy, those deliberate gaps in the outer wall that Silas had incorporated, was functionally sound. The researchers didn't know about Silas Harmon specifically. His name doesn't appear in their report. But they documented his principles: cavity width optimization, compartmentalization to prevent convection, selective use of loose-fill insulation, and breathable outer walls. They called it vernacular double-envelope construction and recommended it as a viable approach for modern off-grid building. This led to a small revival in the 1980s and 1990s among homesteaders, off-grid builders, and people interested in appropriate technology. The technique was rediscovered and given new names: double-shell construction, envelope house design, trombe wall derivatives. Each generation thought they were innovating, not realizing they were recreating something a backwoods carpenter had figured out a century earlier through observation and experimentation. Modern building science has since validated everything Silas understood intuitively. We now have precise measurements for the thermal conductivity of air, 0.024 W/K. We understand convection prevention through compartmentalization. We know how to calculate optimal cavity depths based on wall height and climate zone. We have computer modeling that can predict heat loss rates and fuel consumption with great accuracy. All of this science confirms what Silas proved with a mercury thermometer and careful observation. A properly designed air gap is one of the most effective insulation strategies available, regardless of era or technology level. The irony is thick enough to cut. Modern high-efficiency construction often achieves similar R values to Silas's 1886 cabin, but does so with petroleum-based foam insulation, vapor barriers made from plastics, and complex HVAC systems. Silas achieved comparable performance with locally harvested timber, air, and moss. His approach was sustainable before sustainability was a concept. It was low carbon before anyone measured carbon. It was resilient because it required no supply chain, no manufactured materials, no specialized tools. Today, if you know where to look in the North Carolina mountains, you can still find a few of those original double-wall cabins. Most are abandoned, overgrown, slowly returning to forest, but their walls remain sound. The timber, protected by the outer shell and kept dry by the vapor escape strategy, has resisted rot for 130-plus years. The structures are still standing, still functional, still thermally efficient, a testament to principles that worked in 1887 and work now. Silas Harmon died in 1903 at the age of 79. Local obituaries described him as a carpenter and farmer, noting that he was respected for his craftsmanship. There was no mention of his revolutionary wall design, no acknowledgement that he'd changed how an entire region built shelter. By then, his innovation had become so normalized that it was invisible, the ultimate complement to a practical solution. His original cabin stood until 1967, when it was finally dismantled to make way for a paved road. A few people who remembered the structure's history tried to preserve it, but by then, no one could quite articulate why this particular cabin mattered more than any other. The logs were salvaged and used in other construction. The physical structure disappeared, but the principle, the understanding that trapped air resists heat transfer, that compartmentalization prevents convection, that outer walls can be breathable while inner walls stay sealed, that principle survived in the buildings that copied his approach, in a knowledge passed from builder to builder, in a physics that don't change regardless of whether anyone remembers the name Silas Harmon. And now, in an era of rising energy costs, climate uncertainty, and renewed interest in resilient low-tech solutions, builders are once again discovering that the old ways sometimes worked better than we give them credit for. Not because they were simpler times with simpler problems, but because people like Silas Harmon observed carefully, experimented methodically, and built based on what actually worked rather than what tradition insisted should work. There's a pattern that repeats throughout history, and the story of Silas Harmon's double-wall cabin illustrates it perfectly. We assume that newer means better, that expertise means credentials, and that traditional techniques are primitive simply because they're old. And then reality, often in the form of a crisis, forces us to confront how much we've forgotten or never learned in the first place. In January 1887, the expert builders of Watauga County knew beyond doubt that Silas Harmon's walls were wasteful, overcomplicated, and fundamentally misguided. They had generations of cabin building experience backing their certainty. Thomas Bradley's grandfather had built structures that stood for 80 years. Marcus Finn had constructed stone buildings across 3 counties. These weren't amateurs. They were master craftsmen by any reasonable definition. And they were wrong. Not wrong about everything. Their joints were tight, their timber selection was sound, their structural principles were solid. But they were wrong about thermal efficiency because they'd never questioned it. They'd inherited a building method and perfected that method without ever asking whether the method itself was optimal. They'd mistaken mastery of technique for understanding of principles. Silas Harmon wasn't smarter than these men. He didn't have superior training or better tools or access to information they lacked. What he had was willingness to question, to experiment, to observe rather than assume. When his wife and daughter died in that freezing cabin in 1869, he didn't just grieve, he asked why. Why couldn't he keep the cabin warm enough despite burning log after log? Why did heat seem to vanish through walls that looked solid? Why did some structures hold warmth better than others? These questions led him to experiment with his test wall in the barn, to try different gap widths and filling materials, to measure temperatures and fuel consumption, to observe how caves stayed warmer than cabins, how certain rock formations sheltered heat better than others. He approached the problem like an engineer, even though he'd never heard the word thermodynamics and couldn't have calculated a BTU if his life depended on it. What he did understand was that air, when trapped and compartmentalized, resists heat flow better than wood alone. This insight, available to anyone willing to test it, made the difference between a cabin that required 30 logs per day to stay barely habitable and one that maintained comfort on 8 logs per day. That difference wasn't trivial. It was literally the difference between survival and crisis during severe weather. The broader lesson extends far beyond cabin construction. How many other traditional techniques have we dismissed as primitive or obsolete without actually testing whether they work? How many times have we assumed that modern methods are superior simply because they're modern, without comparing actual performance? The history of building science is full of these rediscoveries. Passive solar design principles that indigenous peoples used for centuries were invented, by modern architects in the 1970s. Thermal mass strategies employed in ancient Mediterranean construction were discovered by contemporary designers. Natural ventilation techniques perfected in pre-industrial societies are now being incorporated into innovative green buildings. Each generation thinks it's pioneering, not realizing it's often just relearning what previous generations knew and subsequent generations forgot. This forgetting happens for understandable reasons. When new technologies arrive, central heating, manufactured insulation, cheap energy, they offer convenience that makes older techniques seem unnecessary. Why build complicated double walls when you can just install fiberglass bats and a furnace? Why master the principles of passive heating when you can just turn up the thermostat? The old knowledge doesn't get actively rejected. It just stops being transmitted because it seems irrelevant. But relevance is contextual. Those techniques become highly relevant again when energy becomes expensive, when supply chains break down, when you're trying to live off-grid or build resilience against system failures. Suddenly, knowing how to heat a space efficiently with minimal fuel isn't quaint historical trivia. It's practical survival knowledge. The remarkable thing about Silas's approach is how robust it was. It didn't require rare materials or complex manufacturing. It didn't depend on supply chains or specialized expertise. Someone with access to timber, basic tools, and understanding of the principles could replicate it anywhere. That's the hallmark of genuinely appropriate technology. It's locally adaptable, requires minimal external inputs, and delivers reliable performance using basic physics rather than complex engineering. Modern society has largely moved away from this kind of solution, preferring instead approaches that require manufactured materials, specialized labor, and ongoing maintenance. These modern approaches often perform well until they don't. When the supply chain fails, when the power goes out, when the specialized repair technician isn't available, suddenly the simple, robust solution looks pretty smart. This isn't an argument for rejecting all modern technology or romanticizing the past. Silas Harmon would have used fiberglass insulation if it had been available and affordable. The point is that he understood principles, not just procedures. He knew why his double wall worked, which meant he could adapt it, modify it, and explain it to others. Modern building often focuses on following codes and installing products correctly. Important skills, but different from understanding thermodynamics well enough to design solutions from first principles. The cost of this lost understanding shows up in places we don't always recognize. The average American home built today requires significantly more energy input for heating and cooling than structures built by people who understood passive thermal design. We've compensated for poor building envelope performance with powerful HVAC systems. This works fine until energy becomes expensive or unavailable. Then we're in the same position as those Watauga County families in January 1887, burning through resources faster than we can afford, struggling to maintain comfort, wishing we'd built smarter from the start. What would Silas Harmon think if he could see modern building practices? He'd probably be impressed by some things: precision manufacturing, engineered lumber, advanced materials. But he might also wonder why we've made heating and cooling so complicated and energy-intensive when the sun, air, and basic physics can do so much of the work if you design for it from the beginning. The ultimate irony is that we now have the scientific tools to understand exactly why Silas's double wall worked so well. Thermal imaging cameras, precise instrumentation, computer modeling, yet we often don't apply that understanding because we're locked into building methods that assume cheap energy and available materials. Silas had none of our analytical tools, but he built from principles that remain valid regardless of technology level. That's the difference between wisdom and mere technique. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Subscribe to this channel right now, because I'm going to keep bringing you building techniques and survival wisdom that actually work, proven not by theory, but by people's lives depending on them. Hit that like button if you're tired of complicated modern solutions that break down when you need them most. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'll respond personally with a traditional building or heating technique specific to your region that could slash your energy costs or save your life in a crisis. This isn't just history. This is practical knowledge that matters. The builders who mocked Silas Harmon in 1886 weren't bad people or incompetent craftsmen. They were simply doing what most of us do, assuming that the way things have always been done is the way things should be done. It took a crisis and undeniable empirical evidence to break through that assumption. The question we should ask ourselves is, what are we assuming right now that a crisis might prove wrong? What traditional knowledge have we dismissed without testing? What simple solutions have we overlooked because we're convinced that effectiveness requires complexity? Silas Harmon's double-wall cabin stands as a reminder that innovation doesn't always mean new technology. Sometimes it means understanding old principles well enough to apply them effectively. Sometimes it means being willing to look foolish in the eyes of experts until results prove you right. And sometimes it means having the humility to learn from how the world actually works rather than insisting it should work the way our traditions claim. That 62-year-old backwoods carpenter, dismissed as crazy by men who'd built cabins all their lives, understood something profound. Expertise without experimentation is just repetition. Tradition without understanding is just habit. And comfort in our assumptions is often what gets us into trouble when conditions change. The double-wall cabin kept families warm for generations. The principle behind it remains valid today. And the lesson, that we should test our assumptions, observe carefully, and respect knowledge regardless of its source. That lesson is timeless. In the end, Silas Harmon didn't just build a warmer cabin. He demonstrated that paying attention to how things actually work beats relying on how we think they should work. That's a lesson worth remembering, especially in times when old certainties are breaking down and we need solutions that actually function under stress. The walls of that cabin are gone now, but the principle remains, waiting for anyone humble enough to learn it and smart enough to apply it. Just like Silas did, with nothing but observation, experimentation, and the willingness to be called crazy until the numbers proved him right. Historical note: this screenplay represents a dramatized reconstruction based on historical building practices and thermal principles documented in Appalachian vernacular architecture. While the specific characters and events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, the technical details regarding double-wall construction, thermal performance, and fuel efficiency are based on documented building practices and thermodynamic principles. This content is educational and historical in nature and does not substitute for professional engineering or building code compliance in modern construction.